Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 2, Section 2, Fertile Crescent Empires. So follow along with your handout and get down the notes that you need. So here we go. The Hittites. They were an Indo-European people from the steppes north of the Black Sea who were forced out of the region by drought and conflicts and settled in Asia Minor, which is now modern-day Turkey. They were founded around 3000 BC, and their empire fell somewhere around the 1200 BCs. Two military advantages that helped the Hittites establish an empire was the mastery of iron making for things like ornaments, like jewelry and such, tools, and most importantly, weapons. Their horse-drawn chariots were made of iron, and they were a little heavier than maybe their neighbors and their chariots. But the thing that makes them unique was that they were manned by three men. You had, for the most part, a driver, and that's all they focused on. You had a fighter, that could be an archer or such. And then you had another man that was known as your shield man, who acted as kind of the defense in that situation. So, looking below here, you have a map that shows a little bit of the Hittite Empire. You can kind of see Asia Minor there, which is basically modern day Turkey. You also see a little bit of the empire stretching south, what would be in areas that are probably part of like Syria and a little bit of Lebanon. All right, number three, the Hittites were a blended culture. Blended meaning that they had their own unique things, but they also incorporated things, cultural things from other cultures that they thought were pretty awesome. So they used Sumerian cuneiform to write their own language. They developed laws similar to the old Code of Hammurabi. Uh, in time, their culture is going to fall, and we're going to have the rise of the Assyrians. And the rise of the Assyrians was due to the fall of the Hittite Empire and the rise of Assyrian military strength somewhere around the 1300s. And it didn't necessarily happen overnight as far as the fall, but by the time we get to the 1200s, pretty much the Hittites were a conquered people. So we're going to talk about the Assyrians. The Assyrians, for the most part, they grew barley, they raised cattle in the lands of Mesopotamia near a place called Assur, which is along the Tigris River, kind of on the upper part of that. And if you take a look at the map here, Assur could have a couple of different spellings. Your map here spells it with an H. If you look elsewhere in the book, it might have another S. It's all about the same. But this kind of shows you where this is located. This empire would eventually stretch to modern day Egypt. And at some point in time, the Assyrians certainly are going to be kind of the force to reckon with their neighbors. The Assyrians became fierce warriors because many of the tribes had invaded their own territory because of its abundant rainfall and its location along the major trade routes. The Assyrians kept their dominance through military power, and the Assyrians had a fierce warrior society. They were using war chariots, very similar to what we heard about as far as the Hittites, and probably modeled after some of the things that they had done. They had foot soldiers. These are soldiers who march on foot. That's how they travel. Along with that, they had a cavalry, which basically was mounted soldiers, very terrifying. All were armed with iron weapons. And the Assyrians perfected what was known as siege warfare. They used battering rams, and these battering rams were used to knock down walls. They also were able to dig underneath certain walls to make the walls a little weak, and eventually use those battering rams to knock them over. But aside from that, they used terror to awe and control their enemies. They were not necessarily the most friendliest society by all means. If they took over an area, they probably were going to treat the people very mean. So Assyrian kings were able to govern through local leaders. They collected taxes for the Assyrians. They enforced the Assyrian laws. And more importantly, they were able to raise troops for when the Assyrians wanted to go to war. The Assyrians were able to maintain peace in their empire because of their efficient government and the fact that they used ruthless punishment for any opposition. They often maimed or killed their enemies. Those who were able to survive were often split up and relocated to different areas to prevent them from rebelling. So, in other words, we weren't going to leave these people in the area where we conquered them. We're going to move them elsewhere just to kind of split them up and kind of weaken them. In time, the Assyrians are going to fall, and they fall to the Chaldeans. But I should mention it took the Chaldeans and the Medes, for the most part, to bring the Assyrians down. And so we're going to talk about the Chaldean Empire. It kind of occurred roughly around the year 612. That's when the Assyrian Empire fell. The Chaldeans made Babylon their new capital. Babylon, we had heard maybe a little bit when you look at section 1, and we'll probably hear those in presentations, but it became their capital. And one of the things that they set about doing is improving upon this older city. One of the most famous rulers was a guy named Nebuchadnezzar II. He was the most famous Chaldean king. He fought the Egyptians. He conquered the city of Jerusalem. And as a result of that, he enslaved the Jews and sent them back to Babylon. If you read scripture, this is sometimes known as the Babylonian exile. Under the Chaldeans, they rebuilt palaces, ziggurats that you can see pictured below here, temples. One of their major cultural achievements was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and this is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. These gardens were located on rooftops, they were located on some of their terraces, but for the most part, they were filled with trees and flowers, and for the most part, made Babylon one of the most gorgeous cities of the time. The Chaldeans also did other things. They created a calendar based on moon phases, and this calendar was used to basically dictate a lot of the things that the government would do. They would look at the moon signs and they would say, yes, we should maybe go to war or issue different decrees and things like that. So the calendar became kind of the center of their life. The Chaldeans' empires, that is going to fall roughly in the year 539. And this occurred less than 100 years after they had conquered the Assyrians. So it was a really short-lived empire. And if you take a look at the map below, you can kind of see where this empire would have held power at different times. All right. So we're going to talk about the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians established an empire along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea in what is now present-day Lebanon. Lebanon is an area just north of Israel along the Mediterranean Sea, and the Phoenician economy revolved around trading. Due to the close proximity to the sea, they had limited resources, and a lot of it has to do with the land itself. There is a really narrow plain between the Mediterranean and where you get into the mountainous areas. So there wasn't a lot of room to do, extensive agriculture. And, you also had the fact that, with the sea, there were a lot of other options. And since the sea was close by, trade obviously becomes one of the bigger factors of the Phoenician society. So Phoenician sailors were able to dominate trade by sailing to places like Egypt, Greece, Italy, Sicily, Spain, along the coast of West Africa. You could go all the way down to what is now present-day Sierra Leone, and that is, a territory that the Phoenicians probably had gone to. There's even talk that they had even reached as far as the British Isles, and that would include today like modern-day England or Ireland. So the most famous Phoenician colony, though, was a place called Carthage. And you're going to hear more about Carthage when we talk about the Romans. But Carthage was really one of the premier cities of its era. It is located in North Africa, basically in what is now the nation of Tunisia. The Phoenicians traded things like timber, blown glass, which was very expensive, very delicate, but probably one of the more important tradable products that they had because of the uniqueness was a purple dye that was made from shellfish. This was a dye that was coveted by leaders, especially monarchs, because they used this dye to make royal garments. There was also the trade of ivory carvings, silver work, and slaves. Not necessarily African slaves, but slaves that probably were bought and sold by different groups of people that had been conquered or had conquered peoples. In number 16, the Phoenicians developed an alphabet consisting of 22 letters, all of which were consonants. Because traders needed to record their business activities, this alphabet really kind of developed. And it's unique because this is an alphabet that is what we would call phonetic, meaning that it's based on sounds rather than basically the picture. So the Greeks would also borrow this alphabet, and one of the things that they did is they added the vowels to it and modified some of the letters. So if you look at the graphic below, you can kind of see what the Greeks and really the Latins would be basically the Romans, what they had as far as letters were concerned. And some of these do kind of look similar, some of them are slightly different. Um, but needless to say, this alphabet was different because it was very flexible and it was really much easier to use than pictographs like hieroglyphics or cuneiform. All right. Thank you very much.